Hi, my name's Jill Marie Morris. I'm 53 years old. I live in Southern California and I'm originally from upstate New York. My story begins in the late spring of 1988 when my husband and I were expecting our first child later that fall, and we're looking to move closer to both of our jobs, and more specifically closer to our future babysitter, who was a good friend of ours who happened to run a daycare out of her home in Watervliet. Basically, that family, those friends, had recommended us to go take a look at a vacant apartment located at 207 19th Street, Watervliet in Albany County, which was diagonal to their house. So we did. I had been aware of this house, never liked it. I am a lifelong, apparently since toddler, psychic medium, and I just never liked the house. It was very well maintained and kept, but I just never got a good feeling of it and always tried to avoid looking at the house. But grudgingly, more so for financial and logistical reasons, I said, what the heck? And my husband and I and our neighbor, soon-to-be neighbors, went to look at it. From the get-go, I had a bad experience. As a matter of fact, afterwards, I started having a series of very progressively violent dreams about the house and about my husband. And it scared me so bad, I literally argued and argued and argued about not wanting to move into 207 19th Street. I lost the argument. Again, logistics and finances dictated that it was better for us to just kind of forego my emotional, psychic senses and take the plunge. And we did, come May, I believe it was, of 1988. Almost immediately after moving into the home, the second floor flat, things began to occur from a paranormal activity perspective. Things would move, things would go missing, but the biggest, most noticeable issue was my husband's behavior. And he just, all I can say is he changed. And the more time we spent in that house, the worse it got for him. The more frequent the paranormal activity took place, and also the more violent the activity became, as well as the more violent my husband became. One of the biggest turning points in the house was late November of 1988. And we had left for work. Nothing seemed out of place. Our son was just a couple of months old, about to be baptized. And we came home from work, and there was the most awful putrid odor I have ever smelled in my life the minute we walked in the door to go up the stairs to our apartment. As a matter of fact, our downstairs neighbor came out and said he couldn't figure out what it was. He had just started noticing it, and he had been home. And we called, at the time, Niagara Mohawk Power Company, which it's now National Grid, and they sent a technician out who thought it may be the furnace. And so they tagged the furnace and told everybody on all three floors, all three families, to get out until they could investigate. So we were gone for 2 days. Nobody was allowed in the building. They called all clear. It was not the furnace. They said it wasn't a dead animal. They tried to inspect for it, but the smell dissipated. But for the time, for about 24 hours, it seemed to be the focal point was the second floor where we lived. So after that, we noticed things really started getting more violent. And Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, later that night after we put up our tree pretty late, Christmas Eve, was the first apparition and the only apparition that I saw manifest right in front of our Christmas tree. And it was a priest dressed in what I would say 1800s clothing, very simple, but priestly. And I knew all the time that there was this darker male presence, but there was something that seemed to be controlling it that was way worse, way super sinister on top of it, that I thought was using this male presence in the apartment. Come winter, going into winter of 1989, springtime, my best friend was violently pushed while she was babysitting our son into where she was sitting in the front room. The front room seemed to be the heaviest part of the house, where a lot of the activity took place with the banging on the doors, 2 doors in particular. And things would go flying off the walls, flying off the counters. Sparks flew out of the iron, literally out of the iron and onto the clothes, and almost started a fire. Things would vanish, literally go missing. And again, these knockings in strange dreams. We had another close friend of ours that never came back after that spring, March as well. He had spent 3 separate times, had spent the night on our couch. That last March evening, we woke up at about 2 or 3 in the morning and he was panicking, and we went running into the living room, and he had slept on the couch, and he was convinced. He was standing at the window on the 2nd floor overlooking 19th Street, and he was convinced again that a male pulled him off the couch and tried to push him or get him to jump through that window. And he said, "I'm done." That was another friend of ours that wouldn't go back. And again, my husband's behavior going into spring of '89, early spring, had really taken a turn. He was exhibiting some really super bizarre behaviors. He was hiding the telephones. He was hiding and popping out, spying on me when I would go to work or come home from work or go to my grandmother's. It was bizarre. I ended up leaving him after he crossed a line and assaulted me. And I went over to Troy, New York, which is literally over the bridge, the Conquer Street Bridge from where 207 was, and lived with my mother. Took my son, and I said, "You crossed a line." Unfortunately, my mom being a nurse and my best friend being a nurse, we couldn't figure out, nothing seemed to fit the protocol of like if he was having some type of mental health issues. It didn't make sense. He did smoke some pot and he did drink a little bit, but nothing that was out of control. He changed in that year's time. So my mom ended up having to supervise visitation, and because he was dangerous, we didn't know what was going on with him, and he remained living at 207, like I said, right across the bridge from my mom's house in Troy. And on the night of June 28th was coming over for visitation, and he brought 2 paper bags full of what he said were toys. Clearly in one of the bags I could see a stuffed rabbit sticking out of it, and he didn't want our son to open the toys until after dinner. So I had him put them on my bedroom dresser. And after dinner, he requested to take a nap, which my mom and I thought was really strange. And my mom was kind of not too sure about it, but she's like, "Okay, but you need to be up, and then you need to give Jimmy his toys and need to be out." So it was getting time. He took a little nap after dinner. He was acting odd. When he woke up, I will never forget, ever, the way he sat up in bed and looked at me. It was not him. And I said, "You got to get going. You can give Jimmy his toys." And I went back into the dining room where our son, who was 8.5 months old at the time, was sitting in his high chair. And my mom went into the kitchen to do dishes way at the other end of her apartment. And as I was cleaning up Cheerios off my son's high chair, I picked him up and had him positioned in my right arm. And I went to turn, and I could hear, as I was picking up the Cheerios, I could hear the paper bag shuffling. So I thought Jim was taking the toys out. So I got my son situated and picked him up, like I said, and I turned. And as I turned with my son sitting right here, my husband was standing there with a loaded 12-gauge shotgun pointing it at us. And I did not know what to do. I literally started screaming and begging and crying. I was like, "Let me put Jimmy down. You can shoot me. Don't shoot the baby. Just please don't shoot the baby." And I just was screaming so loud. I just did not know how to react. And he was mimicking me. It was not, his eyes were black. This was not, his tone was not the same. His expression was not the same. Everything was changed about him. And my mom, she'll say, she heard screaming, but she couldn't figure out what it was. She turned off the water and she realized what was going on. So being a nurse, she approached him from behind, and there was approximately about a 2.5 foot space between the muzzle of the shotgun and my son and I. And she came and she was talking totally different than I was. She was very calm. She was very methodical. At that point, when she started talking to him, I just started praying. And all this time goes by and it never changes. And she positioned herself in that space, that 2.5 feet, and she turned and she was facing my husband, and we're standing right, like shielding my son and I, and she's like, you don't want to do this, and very calmly, and it took her a little bit, but he put the gun down to his side, and he just, like, it was like a light switch moment. I always say that because literally it was like all of that affect that had been so weird and bizarre and scary, it was like he didn't even know what he was doing. Like, if he was like standing there like, what the hell is going on? And he looked at us and he didn't say anything, and he ran out the door, and my mom ran after him and barricaded us in, and I went and called the Troy police. And we thought he went back to maybe 207 19th Street because it was literally across the bridge. And the Troy police came and they asked us a bunch of questions. They put a bunch of guys, policemen and women around the house, and at one point they put me in the car to go look for him at some of his friends. We couldn't find him. They brought me back to my mom's house, and we got a phone call from my husband's best friend's girlfriend, who said, we thought at first it was a ruse, like she was scoping out, trying to find information for my husband. And she said, do you know where Jim is? And I was like, no. And she said, he just called here. And the police were there at the time the phone call came through, and they were like, kind of be careful what you say, because we're trying to figure out if this is Jim trying to get info or what's going on. But she said, he just called here. He just called her house and said to tell Jill and Jimmy I love them, and it's over. And he hung up the phone. And that was it. So she truly was panicking, trying to figure out if we knew where he was, as she didn't know that the police were out looking for him. So it caused a commotion, and some time went by, and the police were talking and coming and going and saying, it might not be safe for you to be here tonight until we find him. And then all of a sudden the phone rang, one of the police officers got a call, and it was the Watervliet Police Department, who said that they had found Jim. He had gone back over to 207 and had shot and killed himself in the apartment. And so it was really hard. 2 weeks later got a phone call from our landlord, Phil DeLallo, who said, I'm really sorry. I can't believe this has happened again. And I was like, happened again? And he said, yeah, when his brother Joe DeLallo owned 207, about 30 years prior, a guy had shot and killed himself in the same living room where my husband did. And I was like, okay, so in my head, I'm like, okay, so that makes sense because of this male spirit, this darker male spirit. But it still didn't add up, and I was just like, I cannot believe this either. And I had to go back to 207 once because of the situation. It was not well, what I encountered, because of what he had done to himself. There were bone fragments that had not been cleaned up on the floor, and I stepped on one, and it was really bad. And I was later warned by psychic Ann Fisher never to step foot on that property again, because she said there was something very evil that was trying to get to me, and it didn't succeed. And it wanted me, and she said, do not ever go step foot on that property again. And so fast forward to 2010, I really started talking about, I need to get my story out. I need for people to hear this as a catharsis. And this is long before the paranormal was known. All this happened. I knew no history on the house other than what I felt as a psychic medium and what my grandmother was even picking up on. Like I said, there was so much that went on in that house in that 1 year period of time, in addition to really the really crazy behavior of my husband that just went spiraling out of control. Our priest was the first one that said, Jill, I think Jimmy went through an oppression, possibly a possession, and he had known Jim since he was a little boy, and he said he had heard some information about the house and about that area, and he was reluctant to tell me. He told my grandmother and my mother that was the first I ever heard about an oppression and possession. And we had a little bit of paranormal activity continue right after he died at my mother's house. That was quite alarming. And there's a to be continued here because there is something else that started taking place again in 2015. And come to find out, I finished the first book, which is my personal story, 207. And I left it at that because when I started researching the history of the house in 2011 through 2013, I found out that, and this is cited information from my research, 14 people died in 207 19th Street. Their names and their information is cited in my second book, Saints, Sinners, and Sacred Ground, 3 of which were suicides, 2 of them male suicides by gunshot, 1 of which was my husband, 30 years apart. Same room in the house, and the other suicide was a male who hung himself from the 3rd floor down the center hall balcony through the center hallway a couple years after the first male committed suicide. And most of the 14 deaths occurred between 1942 and 1992 in that home. And it is something I will never forget. Obviously, I still deal with. The paranormal activity, which started out as mild, typical stuff, just escalated in time. Things got angry in the house. My husband became very, very, very disturbed, obviously, but as history shows, it wasn't just him. And that's my story. Unfortunately, my mom and my best friend were there to witness most of this, including on June 28th of 1989, and can back me up. Both registered nurses, lifelong registered nurses.